This is a Film Stories original podcast.
We made this.
Hello everyone and welcome to the Xcast. The truth is in here. My name is Kurt North and thank you for joining me again for our continued coverage of the second X-File movie, I Want to Believe. We're going through these minutes by minutes as we did with Fight the Future, all back in the year 2020 I believe it was. And the Fight the Future dealt with some sort of plague and virus, which was quite prescient of the Xcast to talk about. But joining me this week is Luke Winch. Luke, how are you doing?
I am very well, Kurt. Very well indeed.
Yeah, we're here to talk about minute 19 of I Want to Believe. Before we do that, though, just a reminder, people can find us on social medias. You can find us on the X-Files Basement on Facebook, where you can find that as the X-Files Basement, the Xcast podcast fan group. You can find us on Twitter at the X_cast. There's also availability to find us on Instagram as well. Sarah runs that for us. And you can also find the Patreon. And the Patreon, you get ad-free access, early access to episodes, and a whole host of other things as well. So please feel free to come over and see us there. This episode, we're going to be looking at minute 19. We've got one more minute after this, Luke, before we disappear. We are going to talk about this episode, particularly I think we're going to look forward and we're going to look backwards, I believe, in this episode personally. We're looking at minute 18 to 18:59. And Scully has left the apartment. She's on the balcony of Father Joe's apartment block. Father Joe's roommate comes out. Let's talk about Father Joe's roommate.
Oh, this is horrible. It's whoever that actor is, he leers very well because it's incredibly uncomfortable the way he looks up and down at her as he walks out. Yeah, that's because when we were doing minute 16, and we were talking about the dorms and how they're kind of paired up with other sex offenders. Surely that's not a great culture to breed within this, because they're all together. They're not being integrated into normal society. They're stuck with other sex offenders.
Yeah,
that must lead to some pretty horrible, disgusting conversations between these people. And I just thought of that as this guy walks down the stairs and looks horribly at Scully. It's just like, it was very uncomfortable, and it just kind of takes your mind into places you don't want it to go, really.
It creates unease because she's at the balcony and walks behind her. Now that in its thing is kind of quite uneasy, and the way that the balcony's blocked, in that he has to walk past her, then walk past her again as he goes down. And I think that the idea of him going down the stairs, it is an illusion, like we discussed with the cigarette. It's kind of like quite an interesting play on the fact that this guy does feel like he's evil. There's no characterization on him whatsoever, but he is going down the stairs, and while he does that little sniffle, and it's very kind of upsetting and uneasy. And I think that's done by design. The question I have really is this all designed just purely for the jump scare of Mulder? And if so, was it really worth doing it in that regard? Or do you think even the jump scare even really needed to happen? Because I think that we get enough of an ominous, disgusting feeling without the jump scare. So I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, that's interesting. I can see why it's there, because it's adding to Scully's unease in this whole situation anyway. I think if we didn't have it, I don't think we'd miss it in any way, because we already know how uncomfortable Scully is in this situation. The fact that she's walked out of the apartment is kind of sign of that anyway. And I think having the jump scare with Mulder, I don't know. I don't think it is necessary, really, because it's just reiterating something that we are already seeing on screen anyway. But I do think the housemate passing by is an effective kind of design of the movie and him going behind her and downstairs. I think that is a good scene to have in. But the jump scare, I think we could have easily done without, and it wouldn't have changed the atmosphere of that scene in any way, really.
Yeah, just with you saying that, actually, and I've just percolated in my brain from what you said before, because Father Joe is obviously the policeman in that relationship, because you're saying about like sort of them having to police themselves, that he feels, that guy feels like he's not retrievable. He doesn't, obviously we don't know anything about the character. The character's just a one-note thing, and it's kind of there for a purpose. But Father Joe lives with that person, in the wider world, and the fact that you've got someone acting like that when Father Joe is completely different, it feels like he is the one that's perhaps been put in there as the kind of, and use like dynamics on like psychological things of like sort of he is the parent in the situation. He's the one that's kind of like keeping him in check. So it's fascinating to think about, as you say, with those the whole idea of this like dormitory being for habitual sex offenders, that they do police themselves, is that there must be some sort of formulation in like how they police themselves. And I think that looking at Father Joe compared to that guy is maybe akin to that. I don't know, but it certainly shows a bit of layering in what we're meant to feel about Father Joe if you've got someone like that living with Father Joe. It's an interesting thought experiment, really.
Yeah, it's also hammering down the fact as well that Scully believes that some of these people are irredeemable. Yeah, and this guy who comes past, he is, in her eyes at least, irredeemable. And the way he looks at her is proof that maybe he wasn't ready to come out of prison, because if he's having thoughts about that with a woman, then who's to say that when he's released into actual society that he won't do it again? Yeah. So there's I mean, you could talk all day about this, but I think that little scene is very effective in a multi-layered way.
Yeah, we just need to make the time up. It's okay. Fine. We've got a lot to talk about in this minute anyway. It's fine. No, yeah, but you're right. I mean, Mulder comes out and says, "So much for kissing his all ass." You can take that one of two ways. You can either take that in that they've had a conversation in the car to say that we're going to have to get the information out of him, or you can see it as Mulder just quipping again, because there's an element of, I suppose you could take it another way, that they have had this discussion in the car that they need to get the information out from him, but Scully has kind of gone like, without expecting, her system one brain is kicked in, the kind of the emotive part of her brain rather than the pragmatic part of the brain has gone attack, and she's not thought about the longer term process, and that's why she's gone to the balcony, because she needs to kind of think about things. But that says so much really about like sort of so much of kissing his all the ass, because they need him. They actually do need him, and Scully's putting that in jeopardy as well. So there's an element of like risk involved in Scully reacting in that way.
Yeah, and she knows that because, she's had a moment to kind of take a breath outside, and, she even says, "I'm sorry." She knows that her behaviour has put the investigation at risk. She couldn't help herself. And this plays into the fact that she, where they are now, she's not ready to be thrust back into this world again. She's where they are now as people, the fact that they're ex-agents, their state of mind is different because they've been away from the game for so long. Being pushed back into this world of murder and evil and disturbing people and all the stuff they've done over the last 9 years, Scully's just not, her frame of mind is very different to what it was back then, and I think she realises that in that instance where she apologises. She knows that her behaviour has put things at risk, but it's because of where they are now in their life as people, and it's just a really, and they kind of reminisce and reflect on where they were and where they are, and it's. I I think it's a conversation that needs to happen in this film because, well, I mean, this was 2008. This came out. When was season 9? That finished in
2002.
2002. So we've had a good 6-year gap. And the movie uses that 6-year gap to its advantage as well, which is great. So again, there's a lot going on in this one little tiny bit, and it's done very effectively.
Just while we're talking about gap then, because that's something we can talk about. What was it like for you in that gap? So, X-Files had finished. There was the rumours were that the X-Files movie was potentially in production. There was all the writing. There was like the green light, and then there wasn't. Then there was all this kind of jumping backwards and forwards. Were you involved in the fandom? Were you aware of anything that was happening? Were you aware this film was starting to be made? How did you come about this movie within that period between the end of season 9 and this film?
Oh, I was following it on the internet like religiously because I know they had a fake name for it. I think didn't they have Mulder or someone wearing like a fake werewolf head? They were trying to do all the misdirections and teasing the fans and everything. So I was along for all of that. So the hype was real because all the X-Files fans had been waiting 6 years for the new movie. I don't think any of us in the X-Cast ever stopped watching the X-Files. I think once it ended, we were like, right, let's start it again. Yeah. Pilot, let's go. So I don't think any of us really stopped, but it was just so exciting to have something new. And those kind of year and a half of hype and all the little misdirections was so much fun. And I don't think I'd be the only one who was a tad disappointed the first time we watched it because I think we were expecting so much more. But as I said, in our first minute together, I think over time I've appreciated the movie much more for what it is. Yeah. I think the hype might have, the hype and the secrecy, I think might have damaged people's expectations to a certain degree. It certainly did mine, and I think now I can look at it in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, I was quite pragmatic with it. I enjoyed the movie for what it was. I'd be lying if I said I wasn't like over the moon with just how good, it didn't. I didn't leave the cinema thinking, "Wow, this is the best movie I've ever seen." Inception kind of would do that. I think only a couple of years later, maybe even a year later, because I think it was Dark Knight and then Inception was the following year. So, I was well into my Christopher Nolan era at that point. So. I had moved on. There was a lot of other things happening. I was in the middle of Lost. I get an opportunity to say, I've got a Lost podcast. I was in the middle of Lost at that point because Lost was 2010 when that finished. So there's a lot of things going on. 24 was still around as well. So there's a lot of things going on, and there was a lot of things that was entertaining me, and it didn't entertain me as much. Having said that, because we mentioned about the Millennium thing in the previous episode, that it was more to my wheelhouse than most people's. It was definitely more, I quite like this. I did go and see it 3 or 4 times, and I got the movie and watched it several times. And every winter when it snows, my mind instantly goes back to I Want to Believe. Yeah. It doesn't go back to The Thing. It doesn't go back to, other movies with snow in it. For some bizarre reason, it always goes back to Mulder looking over a cliff, which isn't in this minute film because that was an extra in the director's cut. We're not doing the director's cut. No. But I always remember that scene, and I don't know why, but whenever it snows, that's what I think. So just finally to wrap up on this minute, just a couple of more things. Like you said about the whole idea that she could hinder that and she's apologised. A little bit of an underplay and talk about the Fight the Future compared to this. There's a little bit of a Mulder and Scully natural debate where they have about you pushed him, you challenged him. A very intellectual, emotional, intelligent conversation that they tend to have about that, and the fact that she's saying he's a creep and a liar, but it's like you pushed him, you're the one that was like really going for him and getting that out of him, and that's a very Scully centric thing to do. And I do think that there is that about these little moments where it's almost a reverse of what I would normally particularly like about TV shows, and that sometimes they're a bit on the nose with saying stuff that's happened or saying stuff that's like in the ether, like directing you to something, saying like, "Oh look, let's get a bit of exposition because of what actually happened there was this." But the way Mulder and Scully's lines are generally delivered and generally written, it's more a case of actually not necessarily even reiterating stuff. It's about actually their conversation and them challenging. So the fact that Mulder's going, "You pushed him, you challenged him, you did this, you did that. You're the one. You're that's why you're here," and the kind of allusions to that are certainly interesting.
And it's great that Scully once she's calmed down, once her mind is kind of unmuddled and she's not seeing red, she starts thinking about it logically. Is like, look where we are. He could be getting fed information by any one of these convicts, you know, about the missing FBI woman, you know, and she started talking about the surgical incision of the arm. So once she's calmed down and kind of found her mind, she starts thinking like she started thinking all those 9 years, logically, going through the evidence step by step. And it's great to have. It's like old times. You know, Scully always finds the counter argument to Mulder's, and then the next minute we're going to get Mulder's counter argument. So it really does, you know, these 2 minutes really hone in on the Mulder and Scully aspect and their characteristics and how they always are with each other. You know, they've obviously spent a X amount of time apart, and it's taken them a couple of minutes, film time at least, to kind of find that balance again, and they do this out here on the balcony. It's really nice to see.
Yeah, and you mentioned about supplying with information. That's I know this is a typical written trope, and there's no other way around it. But it's very kind of like harkens back to like Beyond the Sea, which is a very similar episode. In that, you know, you're talking to someone who's in prison. That person's in prison and is manipulating. Or we think potentially manipulating Scully because she might have, there might be outside intel feeding him in lieu for Lee Boggs. So the fact that, you know, we have this same argument and there's like this same thing of like, well, he could be getting fed information, which is obviously the pragmatic and the investigative way of looking at things. But I do like there was that illusion. There's also like the thing as well in the actual investigation where she says that the arm was clearly chopped off, which will come back later on. There is things that I'm appreciating a little bit more, where it's like, where she says, oh, it's cleanly chopped off. And it's like, yeah, Mulder's arm's almost cleanly chopped off as well. He almost went the way of the Krychek. But it's definitely certainly interesting from that perspective. And going back to what I said, I think in the previous episode, the link isn't, because she's like saying about they're talking about the link, and the link isn't with the victim, it's with the perpetrator, which is why they led him to the arm, because that's where, you know, the thing was. It wasn't connected to the missing FBI agent. So the fact that they've actually got a little bit of a story there that's saying, you know, we're trying to follow this information, we're trying to follow this, but why didn't he lead us to her? It's like, well, he didn't lead it to her because that's not who he's connected with. So I do find that like an interesting story development.
Yeah, absolutely.
And finally, on this minute, you get two things that you could potentially find out. You could find out that you could either find your dead agent and find out that Joe is a fraud. And then that's where we finish the minute. So any questions, anything on this minute before we head into our final minute of this run?
Yeah, that bit where you know, you'll find a body or Father Joe's a fraud is such a it's like literally teetering on the edge of that minute.
Yeah. Well, the minute 20's got, you could be right, but what if you're wrong? So that's what we're going to lead into next episode. Great stuff. Let's go and do that next episode. And thank you everyone for listening and joining our conversation. If you're enjoying this, by all means, go and give us some 5-star ratings on the Apple Podcasts and podcast catchers of your choice. It would be much appreciated. Thank you for listening. And until next time, remember, as always, trust no one.